We have Bob Sutton, Huggy Rao, and John Lilly. The genesis of this program is a new book that Bob and Huggy have co-authored called Scaling Up Excellence. And you'll learn more about what they learned in the writing of that book, and at the end of the program you'll also have an opportunity to purchase a copy should you so desire. A big thank you to SAP for your partnership and for hosting us this morning. Thank you so much, SAP. A lot of very important discussions have taken place in this space. I think it's great that SAP does open its doors for gatherings like this, and there is one person here who's responsible for a lot of that, and that is Ms. Christine Johnson. So thank you, Christine. For our new guests in the audience, a brief introduction to Churchill Club. We are in our 29th year as Silicon Valley's premier independent technology and business forum. What we think about every day is how to move the needle and encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we do this through the up to 40 programs that we present each year, where like minds, such as the people in this room, can connect with one another and ideas. You can find more information about our upcoming programs in your printed program, as well as Twitter codes, and if you are tweeting, please do use the hashtag Churchill Club. John Lilly is guiding our conversation this morning. We have also asked him to participate and contribute his own insights. He is a general partner at Greylock, and he concentrates on companies that improve human experiences through design and technology. He led the company's investment in Dropbox, Tumblr, Instagram. He sits on a number of boards of directors, MessageMe, ClearSlide, Code for America, Mozilla, CitrusLane, and several unannounced investments. His diverse experience also includes running and scaling Mozilla as their CEO. He's been an entrepreneur, having founded an enterprise security infrastructure company. He has been a senior scientist at Apple. I'm just scratching the surface, but it's pretty clear to us that he is an unusually able person with an amazing set of insights as a result of these things that he's been involved with. And let's just go ahead and give our warmest Churchill welcome to John Lilly, and he will introduce our other guests.
All right, thank you, Karen. So it is so thanks for coming. So 8 a.m., it's a lot to contemplate taking over the world. So everybody should feel free to get up and scale their coffee at any time. And that won't be the last scaling joke for sure. So I'm pretty excited. I've been looking forward to this day for a while, because I've known Bob and Huggy for a long time. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment and thinking about the particular sort of audacity of the place we're in the place we live in Silicon Valley, because I think there's no other place quite like it in the world where the default thought is that anybody in a cafe with an iPhone can start a thing and be global within a few years, scale and change the world, like a Dropbox or a Google or a Facebook. There's no other place in the world that thinks like this as the default, not the possibility, but this is probably what you should do. And so I've been excited that Bob and Huggy decided to figure out what scaling means and to write about it and to try to shed some light on it, because it's such a landscape feature of Silicon Valley, and it's such a DNA thing about the best entrepreneurs and how they think and grow. So we have two people. They wrote two people here. Huggy Rao from the Stanford Business School. He's written a lot about. His books previously have been about with words like radicals and revolution and innovation and movements. And so it's neat to have a business school professor think about radicals and revolutionaries. Bob has written a variety of things, a bunch of things with Jeff Pfeffer in the business school around evidence-based management and how you actually know managing based on reason and logic and the way things actually are instead of gut and instinct. He's also written a bunch of books about management, about how to be good bosses and interesting bosses and how to manage in a humane but also a productive way. Good boss, bad boss, and the no asshole rule. So it's interesting to me that they decided to work together and think about what scaling means given the context of their trajectories. So thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Sure.
So maybe what we should start with is, what do you mean when you say scaling? Like when I was an entrepreneur, I got so pissed off because every VC I would talk to would say, okay, this makes sense, but how do you scale? How do you scale to be huge? And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm explaining to you what it means to scale. Now as a VC, I say that all the time in every meeting I have. So can you guys explain to me what you guys mean?
Why don't you go first?
So for us, scaling has two dimensions. Both of them are complementary. One dimension of scaling is sheer increase in the magnitude of a footprint. You grow in consumers or employees or offices or whatever. And there, the problem for us is as you grow larger in size, the probability that the smart people in a large company become dumber, that actually increases. So that's, if you will, the size-related dimension of scaling. There's yet another dimension of scaling which is equally important, and that is you might actually have a pocket of brilliance or excellence in one part of the organization, and how do you spread that to other parts without voltage loss? I'd say both of those are the two dimensions of scaling we deal in the book.
And I think that's the deeper definition and the shallower definition. I'm the shallow one in the relationship. The shallower definition is you want to spread something good to more people or places without screwing it up. And but that's basically, we call it the problem of more sometimes. So that's what we mean.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think no entrepreneur wakes up and says, I want to run an organization that's 15,000 people,
right,
because that's going to be awesome. What they get up and they say is, I want to change the world in this way, and if it's good here, I want it to be everywhere. So what made you guys decide to write about scaling, and why did you decide to write about it? I think if you look in the literature, it's hard to find people who have tackled it head on, right?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, a lot of it just started, and John is also a member of this organization too. We're all members of the Stanford D School, or we're at SAP, the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. So as usual, we're living off of Hasso's money. So Hasso's been very good to us. But anyhow, so in the early days, about 2006, Huggy and I did an executive program on actually the challenge of customer-focused innovation, how to make organizations and individuals more customer-focused. Excuse me. And the first year, people kept asking us essentially the same question, which was, you know, we have a few places that are good. How do we spread it further? And then they'd say we have a scaling problem. And so we had pretty lousy answers. And so we started digging into the problem. And some 6 years later, 7 years later, I guess, here we are with at least one argument about what scaling is. But the advantage of being an academic, by the way, is we were allowed to take 7 years to answer that question because we have tenure and probably most of you don't. And it's an advantage.
The other minor addition, of course, is when both of us realized, I still remember that evening, we were having a couple of nice glasses of wine, and we both discovered that we each thought our answers were pretty pathetic. And then in the best tradition of being a professor, we said, how do we go about answering the question? And then we came up independently with the idea of offering a course. If you don't know anything as a professor, what do? You actually say, hey, we're going to offer a course. And the reason you do that is that's the best way to motivate yourself to get organized, to read up, to actually think of experiences. And that first year in Stanford, we actually gave the students a very simple task of scaling, increase the number of people who wear bicycle helmets when they cycle on the Stanford campus. And that was a very hard thing to do, I might add. Try to do that to young people who think they're immortal. It's very hard to do.
So we had some specific successes, but I gave a talk at Stanford just yesterday on this stuff. And I said, how many of you are undergraduates? They raised their hand, because this is aimed at undergraduates, maybe 200 people in the audience. How many of you wear bike helmets? 2 hands were left up. So I think we still have a ways to go.
Well, so 7 years is a pretty long time. So and don't take this the wrong way. So
but we don't have real jobs.
So you wrote a book on scaling in 7 years, and in that 7 years, Dropbox got started and got huge. Snapchat started, Instagram started and got huge. So is the speed of scaling? How do you guys think about the speed of scaling? Is that changing?
We think the faster you scale, particularly headcount and other things in an enterprise, the more dangerous it is. In fact, one of the arguments we make is smart scaling consists of slowing down the right elements of scaling and increasing the speed of other elements. And one of the things Bob and I are very fond of talking about is, one of the companies that scaled very rapidly until it was acquired by Google, Waze. And it was fascinating listening to the top management team. They'd received VC money, and everybody was exhorting them to scale. Hire more people, now's the time to scale. And what was kind of fascinating was the group of founders quickly got together and said, that's the time to have a hiring freeze. The employees were astonished. You've just got money from the VCs. How come you don't want to scale right now? And what they thought of was, if you actually increase the number of employees at this very point, first, you're going to get very smart people with a lot of ideas about the product, and we constantly have to keep saying no to them. The second is, you're going to have very smart people who believe they're ready to hit the ground running, but that's not really the case. So you've shifted the ratio of unproductive to productive people. And the third thing is, you've actually increased coordination costs. Instead, what they did was they said, let's have a hiring freeze. Let's make sure all the employees focus on one metric, improving user retention after the 3-month period. That was really a job description.
Customer retention.
Customer retention, yeah.
So the other thing that I would add about scaling, and it's interesting to hear John talk about the speed from the VC perspective, but when we look at successful cases, and versus unsuccessful cases, you want an unsuccessful case, we should point out Groupon's a pretty good example of an organization that decided to go real fast, but sort of forgot the notion of talent and getting everybody on the same page. But if you look at organizations that scale well and scale quickly, they'll screw up a lot of things, but they tend to focus especially on having the right people aboard and having them all think in a similarly constructive way and have the same mindset. And it's kind of funny, back in 2002, my co-author Jeff Pfeffer and I interviewed this crazy guy named Larry Page, and after we interviewed him, we said, just a little down the street here, and we said to ourselves, either he is a flaming narcissist and the last standing from the dot-com, because you couldn't really tell, or he's going to get incredibly rich. Both of those truths might be true, actually, but I remember in the process, and I remember talking to John some about this, Google was so picky about hiring that the VCs were pissed at him because he wasn't hiring fast enough. Everybody else at Stanford, because they were interviewing a lot of Stanford people, they'd interview him like 8 or 10 times and then not hire him. And he said at that time, we have to, since he was one of those class entrepreneurs who believed he was building a company that was huge, even though they were 300 or 400 in those days, that we have to be really careful about who we hire because they have to be people who grow with the company, not just narrow specialists. And then I interviewed Shona Brown, or we interviewed Shona Brown for this book. Shona led she was number 4 at Google. She led the non-product stuff for about 10 years and grew the organization from sort of 2 to 30,000. And she eventually said the same thing. And just earlier in the week, we were at Google, and Parsad Sethi, who is head of people analytics.
People analytics.
He said they're having to have more pockets of specialization now, but that's the general focus. So and I'll end with sort of a Huggyism, which is to go fast. Sometimes you got to hit the brakes, and the fact that you have brakes enables you to go faster. So I'd be curious what you think about that, actually, John.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. So one is that I think you got to understand what your business is and what you're trying to scale and what you're not, because not all businesses are the same. So Google's a pretty different type of business than Uber, for example. Yeah. And in Groupon, it's easy, I think, to pile onto Groupon. We were an investor, but it was a little bit before my time, so I'm not particularly defensive about it. But I mean, there's something like they're an $11 billion company that didn't exist 7 years ago. So
the CEO resigned and said that he screwed up. So I would just
Andrew said that not everything was perfect. That's right. But again, 0 to 11 billion.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a very, very small set of people in the world that have done that. And you'd also probably say the same thing about Zynga. Scale very, very quickly. And so it's easy to be critical on the downside that they grew too fast. But still, they created something from nothing and they affected the world. So I think that you're right that they hit bumps and problems. But it's just worth it understanding the type of business, because you look at somebody like Groupon, where their business was essentially about feet on the street. So how do you affect local commerce?
Right.
It's hard to affect local commerce without a lot of employees. I think the contrast would be, I chased Kevin Systrom, for 6 months before we got to invest in Instagram. And it was such a funny conversation because they had 7 people in the company at Instagram and about 20 million users. And I'm like, Kevin, when are you ready to fundraise? He's like, why do I need to fundraise? I got 7 people, I got $6 million in the bank, we're growing like crazy, life is good. And we talked for over 6 months about how do you go from being a product to being a company, how do you scale impact? And 6 months later, he decided it was time to take the gas and go big. But I think one of the things that with internet scale right now and internet distribution is that you can get so much access to so many customers so quickly that when you get your product into market, like magic can happen very, very fast. And so what I've been actually worried about lately is that the lure of the App Store, the lure of Facebook distribution is so strong that people try to get their MVP, their minimum viable product, into the App Store as quickly as possible. But the problem is once you do that, you stop worrying about product fit and customer experience. You start just worrying about the numbers and traffic and traction. And so it changes the nature of the company. And so I think that Kevin was, unusually smart and talented about thinking how to stay focused on this one thing, which is make picture sharing really, really great, and then open it up. I think that Uber and Lyft are the latest examples of real world things that are scaling very, very fast. But they started this kind of crazy thing in San Francisco, which was, well, we'll do black cars for everyone, which black cars at the button from your phone, which seems ridiculous. But now in San Francisco, it's almost hard to imagine getting around San Francisco without Uber.
Right.
And so, one of the things that Paul Graham from he wrote this wonderful essay. I don't know if you guys read it. It said, "Do things that don't scale." He said, "This is the main thing we tell our startups: is do things that don't scale until you're ready to scale." I mean, have you guys read it? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, our quick sort of reaction is scaling is easy, screwing up is easier too. And which is I think something that Bob mentioned. When we think of scaling that produces screw-ups, the phrase that we like to use is cluster fug.
That's because we were censored by our publisher.
And fug with due homage, as it were, to Norman Mailer. So there are 3 things about a cluster fug. The first is illusion. And if you don't do the due diligence and don't think of doing things smartly, you can easily wind up with illusion. The second element is impatience. You can be very impatient about wanting to grow the metrics and other things that you alluded to, John. And the third thing is incompetence. When the 3 conjoin, you actually have a trifecta, which is a cluster fug. And the examples of cluster fug are many and varied. A lot of reforms often wind up as cluster fugs.
Or the Obamacare sign-up is a perfect clusterfuck. From what I actually talked to somebody who was in the meeting with President Obama, and basically they raised their hand and said, "We screwed up, we have no excuse." So even they are saying that. I want to get back to John's question though, because so I did read the Paul Graham article, and in the way that I would reinterpret the Paul Graham article is that when you're in the process of scaling, and for us, scaling is not just growing a company larger, it's spreading something good also across an existing organization. But in the case of growth, and I guess an existing organization that's larger too, you've got to be constantly thinking about what got us here that won't get us there. And just to give you 2 quick examples, one of the companies that we sort of tracked until I got acquired by LinkedIn is Pulse, since it started at Stanford. And the 2 guys who started that, Ankit and Akshay, we talked to them, and they talked about how difficult it was to go from 4 to 7 and then 7 to 11. And those are not very big numbers, but when they got to about 7...
Employees, you mean?
7 employees. Yeah. When they got to they had millions of users. When they got to 7 employees, they were having group dynamics problems and coordination problems. So they broke into 3 little groups. And this is, by the way, one of the key themes from the book, is that adding more people often does not improve things. It creates coordination problems, interpersonal problems. And then they moved to 11. And when they moved to 11, they not only broke up into one more group, and they're all in a room, much smaller than this room. What they did was they had to add a little process. And the little process was they work in their little corner all day, and they'd have a Post-it board. They'd sort of put what they were working on with little sticky notes. And every afternoon, each team would turn around and say, "Here's what we've been working on today. here's what we need help with. And that's process. And, people, and there was a little hierarchy. It was Ankit and Akshay figured out how to do this. And then in another example, which we all know very well, IDEA was very interesting because I was involved in studying them in the 90s. And they used to have a Monday morning meeting with 60 people that worked fabulously well. When they grew to 150, it just didn't work at all. And so, and having watched John a little bit at Mozilla, I remember at one point, and time to turn over to you, John said, you know, when there was 12 or 13 of us, I could kind of say anything, and people wouldn't take me too seriously. But he said, when we got to 100, I realized I had to say the same thing to everybody else, so we stayed on the same page strategically. Am I getting that more or less right?
Yeah, I think that's right. What I realized, Mozilla was my second time as a CEO. The first time I did my own startup, and one of the things about doing a startup is you tell your story over and over and over. You tell it probably 10, 15, 20 times a day. And you tell it to customers and recruits and employees. And I mean, we're all very smart people, and so you get a little bit bored, right? And so you say, oh, well, if I'm getting bored hearing the sound of my own voice 10, 15, 20 times a day, my audience probably is too, so I'm going to mix it up and make it more interesting. But then what you don't really internalize, and it sounds obvious when you say it out loud, is that you're talking to different people every time. And so now, as a CEO, you've told a different story to everybody you've talked to in the day. And so you get significant narrative spread. And I've come to believe that the job of a CEO or a leader of an organization is, in many ways, tell a story of the organization and help the people in the organization understand what they're there for and why they're there and what the mission is and where we're headed. And so as a result, like I gave a very diffuse message as a CEO the first time I was a startup. At Mozilla, what I decided, especially as we grew, is I needed to tell the same story again and again and again. I needed to reinforce it for two different reasons. One is that the company got big, and so you just started talking to more and more people. But the second is that people started relaying, you have managers and VPs and other principals who would relate your story to other people until you get a reflection of the story. And so if you didn't tell it the same way in a consistent way in simple words, it got more and more diffuse, and so you played in the telephone game in a big organization. So I think that was an important thing, and I think it speaks to, you know, I think the older I get, the more I think about this word alignment, which is how do you teach an organization to think in the same way so that they can make decisions when they're not near each other. And I think this probably speaks to your Buddhism, Catholic.
Yeah, we can talk about that in a minute, but I'm just thinking to just finish John's thought, that it's interesting when you have a really large organization, that's one of the reasons that it's kind of boring being the CEO of like General Electric or of Procter & Gamble. So A.G. Lafley, who's the former and once again CEO of Procter & Gamble, when we talk to him, he just says, I say the same thing to literally over and thousands of people, and like keep it Sesame Street simple. The customer is boss. And it sounds really stupid, but he says it over and over again. And the good thing is the counter case. What happens when you have somebody who doesn't do that? Years ago, Huggy and I are in the field of organizational behavior, and there was this guy named John Reed who was the CEO of Citibank. And he decided to collect together a bunch of academics and give us money to study Citibank. And this guy was a very high IQ CEO with no focus of attention. And he would do one like sort of initiative every quarter, the quality movement, 360-degree evaluations. There was always something new, and he'd just lose patience. And so the way you learned to be a Citibank manager was, this too shall pass. And so this alignment issue that John is talking about, as your organization gets bigger, gets more and more important. I'm sorry, this one.
It's not just organization. I mean, I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about organization, but you also think about scaling customer impact. So again, it's all in the world, in the organization, and it's easy to focus on the organization, but that's really a means to an end, right? Exactly. It's not the main thing.
Yes, yes.
So we talk a lot about marketplaces at Greylock, having invested in Airbnb and having invested in LinkedIn and Facebook, which are sort of marketplaces of people. And I remember sitting with Reed. Reid Hoffman, before he started LinkedIn, my partner Reid from Greylock, who also started LinkedIn. And we just started talking about LinkedIn and how to build a network. And I'm like, Reid, I don't think this is going to work because maybe other people will put their networks on LinkedIn, but my network's a really good network. I'm not sure I want to put mine on LinkedIn. So I'm not sure it's going to work. And Reid's like, well, I'm just going to go convince all my friends. I have a lot of friends, and I'm going to get them to put their networks on, and that's how it's going to work. And so Reid did this thing that clearly doesn't scale, but he did it in a way that was aspirational enough and inspirational enough that it kind of started kindling something that worked. And I think that the Airbnb guys went and got customers. I think that Uber will subsidize demand because what they wanted the experience to be was push a button on a phone, get a black car in 2 minutes. And so I think you do things that don't work and because you're in service of this experience when you start.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so can we talk about Buddhism versus Catholicism? Because that's a thing that Michael Deering said.
Yeah, go for it.
Rattled around a lot.
So, John just alluded to Michael Deering, and he has a beautiful and very felicitous set of phrases to contrast the dilemmas of scaling. And the way he sort of puts it is, do you want to be a Catholic or do you want to be a Buddhist? And the implication behind that is, how do you want to spread? Do you want to spread through replication or do you actually want to spread through variation? Catholic, you have one model, you spread, you replicate. Buddhist, what you do is you outline a set of general principles and then you allow local realizations of the general principles and you provide guardrails, as it were. Extreme example of Catholicism, In-N-Out Burger. Very narrow product menu, exactly the sort of same thing. At the other extreme of Buddhism is our friend Chip Conley, who is, if I recall rightly, a practicing Buddhist. 36 or 37 hotels.
Joie de vivre hotels.
Joie de vivre. And they range in price points from $120 to $700. And it's fascinating what his principles are. And he says, every time my people come to me and say they want to build a new hotel, I have only 4 questions. What magazine does your customer read? Tell me that. I know exactly who you have in mind. If it's the New Yorker, I know what kind of experience you want to have. Tell me 5 adjectives that describe the experience. Tell me how the consumer will know those elements of experience across the 5 senses. So if it's sophisticated, how would I as a consumer, when I walk into a hotel, know instantly it's sophisticated? Maybe the bar looks like a library. And finally, how does the employee know all of that through his or her 5 senses? He says those are the 4 questions. And you can build a hotel for $150 a room or $700 a room, irrespective of location. So that's the Catholicism, Buddhism continuum, as it were.
So my canonical Catholic company is Apple. So it seems to me that Apple breaks. So you look at Apple, and I used to work there in the bad, terrible, dark days before Steve came back in 96, 97. But then Apple seems to ignore all Silicon Valley best practices in management. There's no sort of growing people, there's no empowering, there's no helping people make decisions. It seems like the definition of a Catholic company, but it works pretty well. Have you guys thought much about why that is and why it's so different?
Well, this is one of the things people ask us what surprised us in the process is there's a whole bunch of mantras that seem to be in the management press, which are decentralization, empowerment, no managers, and you can just, we can Gary Hamelize you. He just runs around spewing this crap out, and I'm always arguing with Gary about this. And
he's a very nice guy.
But the fact is that first of all, you do need structure, you do need process, and you do need role specialization as organizations get larger. And there's no organization on earth that can function without those things as they get larger. But the other part, and I guess it's partly Buddhism versus Catholicism, but it's also, a lot of it is you have to figure out what the operating beliefs are in an organization, sort of what's sacred and what's taboo. And so I was just we say we were at Google earlier in the week. So Google has this notion where everybody is a generalist and they become more general as they get older, that there's sort of decentralization and kind of self-managing teams. And then as you get more senior, you get more management responsibility, and they're kind of organized around that. But Apple, bless their hearts, they have a centralized organization. They have very specialized people, and they hire people who sort of fit in that role, and it actually works. So that's a lot of what our perspective is. You actually can have a very functional, centralized organization with extreme role specialization. And the thing that people work about at Apple, people who work at Apple, and they'll actually talk to you a little bit, they know very, very little about what one another are doing very often. And I actually think that's quite interesting. In one unnamed Apple executive who talk to me, but usually they act like they're in witness protection programs, if you know people, to steal a line from, that was actually, John said that to the Apple executive who no longer talks to me, he told me this. But he described how at Apple, as people get more senior, they get more specialized. In most companies, I mean, Google is the exact opposite of that. And so in psychologists or sociologists sometimes call this contingency theory, but to me the key thing when you're scaling is you have to have a set of logics about how the people you hire, the way you structure the organization, what your strategic goals are, they actually all fit together in a logical way. And the danger for the management press and all this gibberish about we're going to have big spans of control, we're going to have flat organizations, we're going to have empowerment, we're going to kill the hierarchy. Well, all that sounds great, but when you actually look at the organization, well, Oracle and Apple are doing pretty well. Are they doing those things? And I know a little about SAP too. They are not doing those things.
I've always thought, you listen to Steve talk about how he ran management meetings, what he'd say is that on Mondays he got together with the management team for the whole day, and they were expansive across the whole business. But that's the only group inside Apple that works that way. And I always sort of live by the line that the smartest people in the world probably aren't in the room right now. And so I think that Apple's point of view is like, well, we are the best people, we are the smartest people, and we're just going to go make that happen. And I think to their credit, they've made that happen in a spectacularly amazing way. Mozilla, we were different. At Mozilla, we were more Buddhist in nature, and we really wanted to say, what's the best way to find as many people in the world who should contribute and should construct together? But we had different goals. We weren't trying to ship 100 billion iPhones or whatever. My favorite example of an organization that was Catholic that turned a little bit Buddhist in their old age is TED.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know, so for the longest time, TED was this very little cloistered conference, and about 700, 800 tech elite would go every year. And they would go to this conference and talk about technology education and technology, entertainment, and design, and it would be this very, very high signal thing. And it started growing in probably the mid-2000s, and then somebody named June Cohen, who's one of the principals there, she said, well, what if we put our talks online? What if we put the videos online? And it was a very hotly debated subject because it had been this in-person, high-touch conference for so long. But then when June put the videos online, the thing exploded. And their impact scaled so big, so fast. It was an amazing transformation for them. And then they extended by going to TEDx, which is not just letting their content out into the world, but letting other people create content. And that, I think, has exploded their impact.
And that's indeed a great example. Earlier we spoke about scaling slowly being important because scaling has inflection points. Bob and I just finished a case study about a remarkable couple, Shannon May and her husband Jay. They're actually creating a set of schools in Kenya. They want to change the lives of 10 million students. So their schools offer education, $5 a month, and they're outperforming all the other local schools by a magnitude of 200%. What's striking is Shannon.
This is called Bridge
Academy.
Bridge International Academies, yeah.
So they started with 2 schools and they scaled to 11. And very quickly they realized that what the modus operandi that worked from 2 to 11 wouldn't work from 11 to 50. You got to 50, you want to scale up to 125 schools, you've got to do that differently. And now they're from 125 to close to 300 schools. They're saying, wait a minute, we need to rethink everything. So at each time, they started very much like a Catholic organization, but they're slowly moving towards Buddhism. Conversely, you actually have very large organizations that are very Buddhist. And they're Buddhist in the sense of not Buddhist about what's good, but what's bad. There are very many ways to be bad in that organization. And a lot of turnarounds really have to do with how to take the Buddhism about bad, and you actually become very Catholic and say, hey, a whole bunch of things are unacceptable, and you sort of move in the other direction. So the sequences vary, and that's something we kind of allude to in the book.
I mean, we'll talk about probably bad is stronger than good, but a lot of times it's just putting guardrails on. Basically, what we describe this as behaviors that are sacred and taboo. And just one of the cases in the book at the end of chapter 2 was the rollout of basically the patient medical records. It's called KP Health Connect at Kaiser Permanente. it's the largest healthcare system in the world, or in the United States, private healthcare system. I think many of us know that. And they put certain constraints in terms of getting rid of bad behavior by getting a little bit more Catholic. A real simple one was, if you write an email to your healthcare team, the rule is they answer you within 24 hours. I think that's actually a pretty good constraint.
Yep, so maybe to wrap up before we have questions, one of the chapters in your book that I really thought was neat was imagine you've already succeeded. And this is, the reason it resonated with me is this is a management exercise I do all the time with the teams that I invest in or Mozilla or whatever. And because I think everybody understands what they have to do today. And I think they often understand what they have to do, what they want the world to look like in 5 or 10 years. It's the middle that's hard. And so like figuring out how to work through the middle, like whether you're going forward or backwards. And so what I liked about what you're talking about, Imagine You Succeeded, is it lets you work backwards from the success case. You guys talk about organizations that are doing that, or?
So, this is the idea of a premortem or pre-hindsight. And as John was alluding to, how do you get people to engage in imaginary time travel? Here's the problem. If you're a decision maker, you're thinking about something desirable, you think in a very abstract way. But when you're executing, you have to think in a very concrete way. So most leaders, when they want to scale, they easily move to what we call an air war mode. Be it speeches, the same PowerPoint presentation inflicted 50 times or whatever. And the premise is the more the exhortation, the more the dissemination of a plan, it's sort of going to work. But you've really got to fight the ground war because you got to think of the troops on the ground. How do you get people to be concrete? One exercise is to get them to do a premortem, where you take a group and get them not only to think about success. If we were all engaged in a premortem about a company, we'd say, let's assume we're talking on this very same day, a year from now. Imagine a success happened. Maybe there was a story in the New York Times or whatever. Write a story of how that happened. Very important to do that about failure too. And you need to do both, and people have to do these premortems independently, anonymously, and not together. And once you actually have all these stories, it's very important that they're stories and not lists. And when people write these stories about premortems, it's extraordinary. The most important thing is the unsaid becomes said. In a leading American university, we actually had occasion to do that. And they wanted to move from basic science to drugs, on the marketplace. So you have basic scientists, clinical investigators who are MDs. All of this is happening in the hospitals. When we primed them about a story of how, there would be an expose in the New York Times, it was incredible. The stories that people wrote had to do with, oh my God, donors are pressuring us to accept the wrong kinds of patients for a trial. Or somebody actually knew about all the side effects of a drug, but that information was given in a PDF, and the electronic data record system didn't accept PDFs. Or the hospitalist who's caring for a patient who actually has had a problem in the clinical trial, the person doesn't understand the history of the trial. They actually offer a diagnosis, which actually becomes the basis for a court case. So when people do the premortem, you're actually putting a lot of the unsaid on the table. And that's, I think, the very important thing.
Well, let me just real quickly sort of follow on Huggy. And it's interesting. So this is Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. This is one of his favorite decision-making tools. And just to sort of hit the headline, and then I think it sounds like we should go to questions. The thing that's important, and it sounds really strange if you imagine where we're going to be a year from now versus it's a year from now and we're looking back. I mean, that's almost the only difference between a premortem and just sort of strategic planning. But the premortem mentality, we've actually got a fair number of studies now that when people just switch to this mindset of looking back from the future, that the details of what they unfold are about 30 or 40% more specific. So in terms of, the big problem with looking in the future is we tend, as Huggy said, to be too abstract. And it's interesting that you do that as well, John, but it's the imagine you're there test, looking back how you got there. And it does change some of the psychology of the group dynamics too. But with individuals, if you ask them, you had a bad European vacation or you had a good European vacation, what happened? It actually turns out people get to 30 or 40% more details.
Yeah, it's my favorite management exercise because it just helps you be aspirational, and then instead of trying to think about all the things you have to do next. So maybe we should open it up to questions then. Are there questions for
Comments, questions?
Yeah, questions, comments, whatever people have.
Insults, we like everything. Well, there's one.
Sorry, I can't see.
I think.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating discussion. And I'm curious about this Buddha versus Catholicism model or structure or way of operating in a business. And I'm just wondering, in your research, do you connect which model works best with which environment? There's the business environment, and that's got to be linked to the conditions of the marketplace and so forth. So I'm just wondering if you...
So just, I mean, the quick answer is the more your customers and the local cultural conditions are identical, the more that Catholicism works, and the more that you need local customization, the more that you can have to tilt toward Buddhism. A quick story is IKEA versus Home Depot in China. They opened 12 Home Depot stores in China and tried to do the straight do-it-yourself model we have in the US. They're all gone. They all died because the Chinese people don't do the do-it-yourself thing. IKEA goes to China, same stuff we sell in East Palo Alto, but they have much better delivery services and much better assembly services. And it's assumed when you buy something at IKEA in China that they are going to assemble it for you because it's a different culture with a different set of standards. We could do lots of examples. And the key thing for us about Buddhism and Catholicism is so Huggy and I, in the process of writing this, we had 60 different decisions that people face in the process of scaling, either strategically or tactically. Whenever we wrote it, we kept going back to Buddhism and Catholicism. So that's the main focus of that chapter. And a lot of times it isn't like just a pure strategic decision. It's how are we going to wiggle through today? Are we going to insist on standardization? Or do we allow them to do it the way that they want to do it locally? And if somebody tells you they have the right answer that will last forever, or the right answer in every case, they are wrong. Because it's very different. You have to be actually a skilled manager to do it. But the more varied the context and the more varied the customers, the more you've got to have specialization. And Uber is learning this actually as they move into different markets. I'm thinking of Uber.
Yep.
So my second question around that, when a company transitions from one model to the other, that's a real culture shift, and that's human behavior and so forth, which is a massive change.
Yep.
So what has your research found to make that cultural shift, which is where many companies fail?
Yeah, and this is kind of where, as John sort of mentioned, the key thing about alignment is when we say alignment, often as managers, we instantly think of incentives being the mechanism for alignment. But I think, as was made clear a little while ago, stories are powerful models of alignment as well. Because what the stories do is they actually do bring people together, even if they're not in contact with each other directly. A third element actually is shared rhythms. People don't even need to talk to each other, but the fact they actually participate in a shared rhythm can be a powerful source of alignment. Twitter does this very nicely. Chris Fry was telling us this story when I was telling him,
engineering.
Yeah, at Twitter. So what they do is, they harness the principles of agile software. Every morning a huddle. Doesn't matter where you are. You're involved in a huddle early in the morning. Every week it's a sprint. Every 3 months it's a demo. Every fourth month you're actually releasing a product. And the fact that you have this common rhythm actually is a powerful source of alignment, even if you may be doing things very, very differently. So,
Good. Next question.
Hi. I work in medical devices where when something goes wrong, we have to show the FDA and others what's called objective evidence of how we have improved ourselves. And this usually means for us a change in process, but
Right.
as the years go by, we end up with too many processes. We sort of become handcuffs. So have you found ways that a company can provide objective evidence that they have improved, but it's not a new process? This is like you're taking your isolated good practice and spreading it elsewhere in the firm, but it's not a process. I'm just wondering what you guys have found.
Yeah, very quickly, I love your phraseology of process becoming handcuffs. We actually talk about it a little bit in the book, and we say one of the things you want to do is, if you want to really scale, you have to cut cognitive load. And the reason you have to cut cognitive load, and this, by the way, is our definition of excellence. Excellence is where people do the right thing even when nobody is watching over them or watching over their shoulder. A lot of the processes are, in a sense, substitutes for cultivating that kind of mindset, if you will. Now, the smart thing organizations can do is they can cut load, because the more load you put on people, the less willpower they have. One of our colleagues at Stanford did a beautiful experiment. A group like this randomly split in two. All of you have to remember a 7-digit number, each one a unique one. All of you a 2-digit number. He opens the door, and then like you have these tables there. One set of tables is laden with chocolate desserts. The other set is laden with fruit. And he's looking at who goes for the fruit and who goes for the chocolate. And it's amazing. People asked to remember a 7-digit number. They actually lunge for the fruit, the chocolate first. And the reason is, you see the temptation of chocolate, but you actually can't resist it. And so, when you think of processes, what we talk about in the book is lots of ways of reducing load, and we talk about the subtraction game, where you reduce load is a very important way of making sure you actually improve. Because when people see the load, they give up. You won't even have the evidence in the first place.
Yeah, I think if you're building a software system, what you would want to start doing is it starts to get crufty, overbuilt, you start to refactor. So a software architect's instinct is, well, this is a little bit too complicated now, let's refactor, let's break things down into the new components. It seems to me that in this case, the FDA, what you need to be able to do is get them to say, yes, we accept the refactoring, and we accept that the refactoring leaves you at a steady state. So it seems to me that you have to get the FDA or somebody else to be willing to say, we'll look at this reduction in complexity as the new baseline, because it gives the same outcomes. It seems to me something like that.
Yeah, so I know other people in the medical device industry, and following John's point, the FDA could use a little empathy for the position that people like you and your companies are in, and I think we would all be better off. I would love to see the experiment of to have them to try to complete the process they impose on you to do their work. It actually might make the world a better place.
Next question.
Thank you. The question I have regards application of what you just discussed in real-life scaling. It seems to me that the variations that drive the right answer, one is systematic, the other might be too darn unique to make a pattern. For example, if I were to make a broad generalization, the techniques we discussed is more like developing a vaccine for last season's flu. It works fine if the virus doesn't change too much. So the more important question, or more interesting question, is, does the variation change so much in the typical startup? For example, if it's driven by the unique characteristics of a leader, in which case, like for example, Apple can break all rules because Steve Jobs had a unique approach. In that case, we could perhaps make more sense out of, these are the predictable variables and these are the unique ones, and for the unique ones, you're on your own.
Yeah, that's another way of saying, what do you actually give discretion to people for? And I think your point about, when there are a lot of unique things, you can't actually have an algorithm to scale, and you allow local people to make the decisions. At the heart of all of this is a wonderful law called Ashby's Law of Requisite Variety. How much variety there is cybernetic law?
It's a little bit of a long thing.
But when you sort of simplify it, the idea being that how much variety is there in the environment, you've got to replicate that same variety in the organization. Otherwise, you simply can't cope with that variety.
Yeah, I would say though that I think the most ambitious entrepreneurs They think less about matching what the needs are and more about making the world a certain way.
That's right.
And so, you can argue that Apple is indifferent to customer needs, but what I would say is that they went and they made the world the way they wanted it. And so I think that you got to understand that as you scale, the environment you're in and the world also changes in the success case, which is another reason why imagining success matters, because it's this feedback loop of a system.
So John actually just brought up something really important that I want to emphasize about the Catholic Church, and let's go another church over, the Mormon Church.
Right.
Okay, so the better your missionaries and the more doggedly they work, the less Buddhist you need to be. So forget the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church actually allows a lot of local variation. The Mormon Church, not so much. I know a lot of Mormons, and they all go on that mission, and whether they're in Kenya or Kansas, they don't really change that much what the line is. So there are different models. One is adapt to the world, the other one is change the world. And from the beginning, they sort of had that Jobsian thing that we're special and we have the vision and you will all soon be one of us. So that is another model of scaling. Yep. And it is interesting that, Apple, even under Tim Cook, is showing some light hints of Buddhism that we didn't see before. Not a lot, but a little bit.
I think light, yes.
Light.
Next question. Doesn't matter.
If you were walking to a rapid, this is like a joke. If
Yeah,
you were walking to
a priest, a rabbi, and a Buddhist walking into a rapidly scaling company.
So think of it like a due diligence, and you had a day to decide whether the company was going to succeed or fail. What would be the 3 factors you would look for to make the decision?
Let's give that to the guy who does the real jobs here. We're just academics.
I try not to decide. I try not to decide in a day. I think that most of what companies are is not making decisions right now. They're making long-term relationships and building and collaborating. I think you look for a bunch of things, though. I think you look for whether the product's any good and whether people give a damn about it. I think if people don't care about the product, I think it's pretty. Even if there's growth, they say, well, is this really the right thing? I think you look for a management team and founders who are flexible and creative and listen and are non-defensive. So I think what you want is one of Andy Grove's favorite phrases, which is he wanted founder of Intel. He wanted employees who had strong beliefs held loosely, or he wanted his people to fight like they were right but listen like they were wrong.
Wisdom. That's the definition of wisdom, actually.
And
yeah.
That's the key for me. Is like you have to, as an entrepreneur, as a founder, you have to believe that you can see where the world should be, and you have to believe you're going to get there. But you have to listen and you have to pay attention. You have to sort of react to the reality in the world. So I think that product people love and founders who are like that, and it really helps a lot when you can see it replicated in the culture down to not just VPs, but developers or designers or customer service people too.
If I can quickly piggyback, if there was one metric that Bob and I certainly have talked about that's worth thinking about, is when you observe the top management team and even the layer beneath them, we always like to track one ratio. What's the number of questions asked to the number of statements made? And when I say questions asked, we don't mean in an intimidating way, but in a way designed to light up as many light bulbs as possible. So the more questions people ask, we think that's a good indicator of what's likely to happen. The second thing we notice is how much bad behavior there is in the organization, because bad is way stronger than good. And the instances of bad behavior vary, but what bad behavior tells everybody in the organization is nobody cares. So how fast you get the bad out is, I think, another important metric.
Okay. So finally, just one that at least is one of the things that I look for. Yes, having a good product and having good people is all important, but I also look to see whether this is a very Jobsian thing, is whether the focus is on the pride of doing great work or on the money. Because, and it's really interesting, because when you're just focusing on doing the best work that you're going to be as proud of as possible, to me it's a little bit like Zen in the art of archery. You're thinking about going through all the right processes without thinking, oh, it's going to be so great when I'm rich. And when people think like that, they tend to get screwed up. And in two organizations, very different organizations. One I know well, the other one I know as well as anybody else, which is Apple, since I don't get very much information about them. But from what I know of Apple, from folks like Adam Lashinsky, who we've done Churchill stuff with before, pride really in the Jobsian world was really driving. And then in fact, John's got a great blog post on this. But then if you go to Pixar, and I know them quite well, as they're earlier in the week, that's the whole thing at Pixar, is you focus on doing something that's so great and you're really proud of it. Just, to tell a quick story of what this looks like in real life. There's a guy named Tom Porter who's now a senior executive there. He's actually in charge of how the 1,200 people or so are assigned at Pixar. But in the old days when he was an engineer, he actually did the fur on Sully in Monsters 1. So think of Sully, the big blue monster. And so he said every couple of weeks, Jobs would go into his office and stick his face right in his face and say, so what your goal is when Sully is up on the screen and he's running through the wind or it's wet or he's moving, that the fur looks awesome and you say, that's my fur. And he said, you should think about that every day. And Tom Porter said that's all he thought about was for 2 or 3 years. And if you look, especially the era that was done, Sully's fur is absolutely awesome. So I would go, pride's a pretty good thing, and not that kind of arrogant pride, but that authentic pride that I've done something good and done it with others.
That's right.
All right, next question. I think we have a couple minutes left.
So first, I'm sure Jobs didn't say it quite that kindly.
No. At Pixar, so they got the nice Steve at Pixar.
Right.
So if you talk to people at Pixar,
Happy Steve.
the happy, nice Steve. That was the nice Steve.
So I had two only loosely related questions. One is whether you think any comments you have on scaling lean startup, like preached by Steve Blank, et cetera, whether that whole, the level of detail on customer fixation, getting out of the building really works for very large companies. And I'll let you answer that one first.
Well, the question is whether lean methodologies around customer fit, product market fit, and focus on customer, whether that works in large companies?
Yeah, if it scales. It's just a comment of if it really scales.
Sure. I think focus on making things that people give a damn about is a pretty good for no matter what size you are. So I think there's things that work and things that don't. I think that there are things that, there's just like the physiology of a spider wouldn't work at a large scale. I think that the physiology of a lean startup won't exactly work at a large scale company, and you have to understand there's some overhead and that kind of stuff. But I think the focus and the foundations are probably right.
Okay, so the second one, only loosely related. What about scaling across organizations? And the gentleman here asked, well, you actually mentioned KP and then had a question about medical. So one of the big problems facing the world, let's just limit to the US, is interoperability of electronic health, personal health information. And Epic is famous for resisting. It's the most successful company in electronic health records, and it's also the most famous for resisting interoperability, and they worked. And yet now we have government mandates, et cetera, to enforce interoperability. And if you step back on our objective, it's hard to argue against that. But so how do you, so this is a scaling problem on a national scale across many organizations. So do you have any suggestions or observations on how you do that?
Speaking of products people love, Epic. It's not a product that anyone loves. I think that sometimes you can do things by trying to scale. I think there's, inside an organization or inside I think more loosely than that, a group of entities just try to do something. I think you can get aligned up around mission or around goals. I think when you got competitors, I think it's somewhat harder. And so, Todd Park is the guy that's driving much of this stuff now, or he was. So he's Obama's CTO now. Before that, he was CTO of Health and Human Services. And what his insight was is sometimes you can try to get people to do the right thing. Sometimes you need to pay them to do the right thing or penalize them for not doing the right thing. And so I think that the scheme there was that Medicare would pay if people interoperate, and they won't if they don't. And I think that sometimes you can talk about management practices and alignment and Buddhism and Catholicism. Sometimes you just have to pay for it.
And on interoperability, the way they did it at Kaiser, where they moved from Buddhism more to Catholicism, they put in guardrails, and the way they forced all 9, without forcing them, the way that they forced all 9 regions to do interoperability and other standards was essentially they wouldn't give them money to update their software. So this is incentives. If they did their own thing, but if they had interoperability, they did get money. So everybody who ran every region ran the numbers, and that's what constraints are very important for scaling in general.
I would say that incentives, and especially monetary incentives, are blunt force instruments.
Yes.
You get exactly what you pay for. And so I think it's more delicate and more nuanced and ultimately stronger not to do that. So that's why we haven't talked a lot about financial incentives, because I think ultimately it doesn't make as robust an organization.
That's true.
But I think that sometimes you just have to do it, especially when fundamental incentives are not aligned.
And sometimes you do have to fire people. You know, it's not a nice thing to say, but sometimes it's necessary.
All right, so one more question? Sure, sure.
My question related to what you just said about fighting people. So we have been talking about scaling up excellence, but what about, downscaling, downsizing the company?
well,
what do you do with the morale and the alignment and all that kind of stuff?
You mean when you're downsizing? Are you talking?
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, the last thing that I would want to leave you impression is that more is always better. That sometimes something that's little and wonderful, when you grow it, it just turns into a piece of shit. So you got and you excuse
Lesson
me,
for
but,
today.
But it's true, and because you expand too fast, or it's something that really is dependent just on one sort of local person. So I mean, a good example, since many of us are from this area, some of us may know there used to be 2 John Bentley's restaurants in Redwood City and Woodside. And John Bentley likes to do all the cooking himself, or most of it. He couldn't run 2 restaurants. So he couldn't deal with a cognitive load. But in terms of as you downsize, I did a lot of research on organizational decline early in my career. To me, a lot of times it's a great opportunity to get rid of the stuff that's always been in your way and you knew you should have gotten rid of for years, and you finally have the opportunity to do it. And it's interesting, I'm probably going to say something I'm not supposed to say, but Huggy and I are going to spend some time with General Motors executives next week. And since I knew a lot about General Motors up until about the time of the bankruptcy and President Obama firing the CEO, which I thought was interesting. And so I want to see whether, given the opportunity, they've actually used it to get rid of all the crap that was getting in the way to get things done. So sometimes downsizing isn't all bad. And organizations do get too big and do get too cumbersome and have too many people. Sometimes it's necessary. And sometimes, and I didn't do this, John did. John was involved in bringing an organization, was it from 200 back down to 12, and then selling it, right?
We should have gone smaller, yeah.
But there's no way you could have done that massive
right.
change in strategic focus unless you
have to get rid of some of the non-core. Yep.
Yeah. So, but John's actually done that. We just talk about it.
Good. I think we're